All right, our second topic today. I want to take a look at what's been stuck us as very alarming, man, is the kind of attack with misinformation on FEMA, which is your federal agency, Federal Emergency Management, and going when we have the aftermath of hurricanes or any natural disaster, FEMA shows up, brings in money, brings in manpower to help the cleanup, help people get their lives back together, and but till I guess pretty recently, this was not a controversial or a political thing. This was just something that was happening in the background, and in addition to people doing stuff with charity, but FEMA was like an organizing factor of this. And so, but in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, we saw a lot of claims coming in from right wing politicians and the Republican Party, allegations, misinformation, however you want to put it, disinformation that FEMA was not helping people, or that FEMA was only helping people if they were a certain political affiliation, or that FEMA is spending all its money on immigrants or something like this. A lot of this stuff now obviously a lot of this stuff is baseless. Like it's not like people are citing things. It's just what people have learned kind of in this internet age. You can throw stuff out, and if it's inflammatory enough, it'll get picked up and circulated because it's inflammatory, not because it's true. And so, like that's become a technique now, where you just throw something out and it'll circulate. And then once people see it a certain number of times, as we know from the fire hose to falsehood propaganda model, once people see it a number of times, it becomes true in their mind. And so I wanted to ask you though, Tunde, like this is now in following this, we've seen reports now that people are threatening FEMA workers and so forth. And I guess the last piece I'll add to this introduction was just that we know that recently also, when it came to authorizing FEMA funding, there were a lot of right-wing or Republican congressmen, over 100, that voted against the funding of FEMA. So they vote against it, the funding of it. And then now the measure passed, but it passed over their votes against it. And then then when FEMA shows up, they start disparaging FEMA and so forth, trying to turn people against FEMA. So I want to get your thoughts on this. Like, what do you think about the way that FEMA's been attacked in the aftermath of these hurricanes? Whether you want to connect it to that funding vote or anything, just what are your thoughts on that?
Man, it's I'm actually very sad just that this continues in our culture and our nation, and there's a lot going on with everything you just said and everything that's going on now. So let me try and unpack it a bit. I'm sad because we are witnessing really like the breakdown of trust, like nationally. Whatever little bit of it was left before this is broken down even further. We're looking at a breakdown of truth. And like you're saying, that there's just everyone's can walk around with their subjective truth. And I know we're going to talk about FEMA today and what happened with these hurricanes. I think that's extremely important. That's why I feel like this is an inflection point, because this is now we're talking about natural disasters. We're talking about more than 200 people dead. And we're talking about the role of leadership, the political class, in governing our country for the long term and not lurching from crisis to crisis because they're emotional. And when you mention about 100 Republican people in Congress, let's look at those numbers. There's 435 members of Congress, of which 220 are Republican from the Republican Party. That means almost half of the entire congressional delegation of one party voted against keeping the government open and funding our natural disaster, our largest solution for natural disasters in the middle of hurricane season, when the forecasters are telling them that these hurricanes are on their way. And so to me, that's a lack of governance and taking serious your role as a political leader in the country. But that's one prong that I'm seeing, right? The inability to govern from the Congress, which is sad.
Yeah. Well, let me throw before you get to the second one. Let me just react to that one real quick, because I saw that too, and it's kind of that I don't know, the poor governance two-step, where you kind of you work to kind of create or exacerbate an issue or to not address an issue, and then if the issue comes up that you kind of work to undermine, you find a scapegoat. Usually some kind of outsider or someone that it's difficult to defend, who can't really defend themselves, or somebody that gets people riled up emotionally. So, and I look at that as both and I know we're going to get to this later, but it just like the climate change aspect of this, like I was just blown. Like you got Republican congressmen talking about people are using lasers for hurricanes and doing all this, and it's like people have been talking about that climate change is gonna cause bigger and badder storms for decades now, and then bigger and badder storms start happening, and they're like, oh, and how could this happen? It must be something. It's like, what are you talking about? Like people have been talking about this for decades. And so it's that piece, and then it's also the funding piece. It's like, you're voting against keeping the government open, against federal funding for this. Then the reason for that stuff happens, and you don't want to talk about the fact that you were voting against it. So you make up something else, so it's this two-step that is very manipulative, but it takes advantage of in the same way, like in our first part, we're talking about how the gambling the apps were taking advantage of weaknesses in people who were like who may have or prone to addiction with gambling. This takes advantage of people's biases, either their biases or they're not following all the information or anything, but it's throwing out red meat to keep them looking away from the fact that these people aren't governing in a way. Like what you want governing, you want leadership to be, looking at this stuff in advance and making plans and not just making it up as they go along or running around with their hair on fire all the time.
Yeah. It's really dumbfounds me how grown-ups who are elected to Congress, just don't appreciate that roads and bridges don't grow naturally from the earth, right? Like they're not trees and they're not just there forever. They need maintenance. We need to shore up our system. So anyway, that was kind of my first one. My second one that why I say there's a lot going on, and I just see a lot here. And that's why I want you to comment on what I'm going to say here now, because the second one is this kind of post-truth, which comes from the type of leaders we have in our society, right? So again, this is a great time. This is a natural disaster to contrast the style of leadership. It was one thing when we did the show just a few weeks ago about the Haitian migrant thing and all that, and then the sitting senator of the state, which is being attacked for this, Ohio, and the current vice presidential nominee acknowledges on a CNN Sunday show that he made the whole thing up. And so now here we are, just a few weeks later, with something even bigger affecting tens of millions of Americans. Like I said, there's been deaths, there's people without homes. And I take this maybe a little more emotional because you and I live in South Florida. I've been through several serious hurricanes. I know what it's like to not have power for a week. I know what it's like to have my roof have issues and water leaking in. It's very personal, and it's your home, and these things affect people. And to sit there we have one leader, and I don't care what people think about either Trump or Biden, but I'm just looking at them in this moment. Biden's an old man that gets made fun of because he can't talk and all that. But you know what? When he gave his speech about this recent hurricane stuff, it was normal what you would expect from someone. Everybody come together. Let's stop the BS. Let FEMA do its job. We're going to support everybody. Donald Trump in the last week not only has lied about the federal government and their response, he continues to push things like illegal immigrants have taken over apartment complexes in Colorado. He's pushing the immigration thing on the migrants. And then he's also now threatening the state of California that if he wins again, he's going to withhold aid next time they have fire because he doesn't like their governor. And I'm just looking at this contrast because, again, we have a leader in our state, in Ron DeSantis, the governor, who's refused to meet with Joe Biden twice right now because I'm sure he doesn't want the optics that he met with a Democratic president right before the election. I don't think that's right. But that's kind of my point, is saying we have one set of leaders that in this moment where everybody's hurting, or a lot of people are hurting, it's just all they can do is politic and make it about the other side and
try to divide.
Not that this was a natural disaster. That's my point. That's why I just want to hand it to you. But I want to finish this about why it really bothers me that Donald Trump made the comments in California he made. Forest fires are natural disasters. He's threatening a state that if he wins presidency again, he's going to withhold aid because he doesn't like the governor personally. I've never seen this in the United States. And that's my point, is saying leadership is important because clearly, because he behaves that way and he's a leader, there's a lot of Americans that are following that. And this is disrupting our entire country. I mean, we don't need the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians attacking us. We can do a great job from within. As I
Well,
see.
yeah, I mean, it goes back to the united we stand, divided we fall thing, and it makes you wonder, kind of what is the overall objective. And that to me, like, it's interesting you were there, because I was looking in the same frame, but from an even broader perspective. Like, what's the goal of that?
Yeah.
What's the goal of when a natural disaster happens to try to say, okay, well, let me use this to turn people that listen to me against the government or against their fellow Americans? Like, is the goal to just divide Americans? Like, so if
Yeah.
we do we no longer agree that united we stand, divided we fall? Are we not a stronger country if we work together on things? And is that out the window now? So I'm looking at it like our enemies, meaning our adversaries, however you want to put it, like the Russias of the world, want us divided. Why do they want us divided? Because our adversaries view the American public at each other's throat as helpful for their interest. So why do we have our adversaries externally trying to divide Americans while we have one of the two political parties in America using opportunities like this to seeing these things as opportunities to divide Americans as well? What side are you on? When your goal becomes, and again, this is because it's a natural disaster, I think it really stands out. When a natural disaster happens, this is a great chance for me to try to make people who listen to me hate this other person, this other American, or hate these other group of Americans. You got people threatening FEMA workers. Like, what is the goal here? And so I think from a bigger picture standpoint, I think we just have to look at this and wonder, is the goal here to divide Americans? If so, do we think now, or do some of us think now, that that's a better approach, is to divide Americans, that some Americans, we're not stronger together, that we need to be divided and so forth? And if that's the case, if you think that, or if someone thinks that, why do you think that our adversary nations want to divide us as well? Like, do they think that makes us stronger too? And so that's why they're trying to divide us? No. And so it really, it's concerning to me, because, and I know we're going to have a show about this, but the idea that we're have a show like this in the future, it's concerning to me, because our system relies on, and this is a consent of the governed. Our democratic system, we're going to come together, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You have to want the system to work. This isn't a kind of system that you impose on someone. Hey, we're going to vote, we're going to elect people, and then once the elections happen, we'll roll with the government for a while, and then we'll have another election after that, and so forth. That only works if everybody buys in, or if a critical mass of people buy in. If the goal is to divide people, to turn people against the government and against their fellow Americans, to me, I see that as the goal of these Republicans or these right wingers, is to make it so to break our system, because our system doesn't work if one of the two main political parties decide that they don't want it to be in it anymore. It doesn't work anymore. So if they're opting out of the system, we're in trouble, and that's what it looks like. I can't think of any other reason why you would spend so much time, energy, and effort and use natural disasters as opportunities to divide people.
Yeah, well, like you said at the beginning, part of it may be just to save face because they voted against funding to keep the government open.
I hope that would be if just trying to save face from the standpoint of, I voted against FEMA funding. I don't want that to be the topic of discussion. Let me just throw out immigrants or something. That would be better than I'm just out on the idea of a representative democracy.
Well, that's why, the reality seems to be that democracies and republics that have some sort of representative government do tend to end through internal combustion and not from external forces. And this is how it happens, to your point, that, enough people just check out from respecting the idea of doing things together.
Yeah, working together.
Because what I was thinking of when I was preparing today, and I was reading about the 100 people that voted against funding the government just to keep it open. That's my point. And that's my thing too. Like, a lot of these FEMA people
bearing down on us. We're looking at the radar.
No, I know, but it's also like a lot of these people that work in the government are Republicans. And they, a lot of them voted for Trump, and they want a Republican administration back and all that stuff. So it's just terrible, like you're saying, that they're turning people against their own constituents, in a sense, people that support them otherwise. And so what I'm saying is, like, because the third thing, I know we had the first, the second. Now the third one for me that's interesting is kind of this questioning of truth, which goes into everything that we've just discussed, right? The ability of the ecosystems, but then having leaders that are willing, without shame, to lie, and then, as you're saying, having a population that then gets disturbed enough that they find their fellow citizen to be more of an enemy than an external adversary, especially in a time of stress and need, like a natural disaster. So, and that's why to me, the natural disaster really stands out more than, I guess, other things, because you and I, let's just talk about 2024, forget about, prior years. What have you and I discussed on this show randomly? A couple of things I can think of, like the fact that yesterday, we didn't discuss this before yesterday because this happened yesterday, but the things like the economy is where I'm getting at. We've discussed that. Yesterday, the stock market, again, both the S&P and Dow indexes hit new highs all time. But yet there's a high percentage of Americans that think the stock market is lower right now than it was in January of this year. Yeah. Why is that, right? That's not because they're stupid. Is because, number one, there's people in their leadership bubble that say it. And number two, in their ecosystems of media, social media, cable TV, they're being told these things. So
the technological advances allow people to be isolated in information bubbles. Yep. And they're in these information bubbles. And so they don't know whether it's light or day outside. They only know whether, like, they're literally in a black box.
Yeah,
and they only know really about the outside based on what the people at the door say. The people at the door are saying, hey, it's dark outside, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. And the other is, like I mentioned at the beginning, that a whole town was taken over by illegal immigrants. And my first thought in my head when I heard that about 2 months ago or something was, well, where's law enforcement? Like, wouldn't they, if the local police can't handle them, the state troopers of Colorado will show up. And if they can, they got SWAT teams, then you got a National Guard. I can't believe that a bunch of Venezuelans would do, some AR-15s took over the entire city. But it's like, okay, I don't live in Colorado. And like you said, information silos and all that. But now here we have a natural disaster that affects tens of millions of people, and people are hurting, and it's like the same thing. And the fact
it's not like the first time we've ever had a natural disaster.
So it's not like a hurricane, and it's not like we don't know that hurricane season is between late July through November. It's it's the exact time the hurricanes always come, September, October normally, and it's the same thing. To sit there and say that they control the weather and all this conspiracy stuff, and now. This is, again, where there's a kernel of truth sometimes. Is there something called cloud seeding that the government has attempted in the past? Yes, to try and make it rain and precipitate a bit more in areas that are arid. That's far different than saying that you can cause a Category 5 hurricane by sprinkling some stuff in a cloud. And again, instead of, and this is exactly what you and I predicted, people that have been denying climate change and who have made the environment into a political football for reasons unknown to me, unless you're
apparently
a lobbyist
to divide Americans. Apparently, that was the goal.
The only way it makes sense to me is if you're an executive at a fossil fuel company. Then I'd probably
then it's your bottom line. Then it's your bottom line. But to make it a political issue,
they're a very small percentage of the country.
But get to your point though, because I know this is a good point.
The point is, I'm just saying is that at the end of the day, that I do believe that instead of coming together and saying, whether you believe in climate change being man-made or not, at this point, I'm beyond that. It's more of the earth is warming, these storms are getting worse. Just how are we going to deal with it?
And to your point, though, what you were about to say, though, that we've talked about for years now, is that when the storms start getting worse or going into places that they historically wouldn't go into, these people who are denying climate change weren't going to turn around and say, oh, you guys are right. I was wrong. They're not going to do that. They're going to be like, no, they're going to make up some other stuff. You know what I'm saying?
They're going to blame black people.
That was our joke. to be fair,
that's what happened. Now it's the Haitians. They were going to blame black people. That's their fault. Yeah.
So they're going to blame black people.
We didn't think of trans back then. They didn't exist. But they're blaming them too.
Yeah. So
those black trans people must be the worst. Yeah.
I think, and describing it as post-truth, and I've heard this, and you and I are both, we're reading the book Nexus, and we'll be talking about that in the coming, in a month or two. But and that talks a lot about this in terms of truth, and information, whether information is about truth or whether it's about order, different things like that. And so post-truth, I'm not going to go into that kind of the conversation. But the idea, I do see, though, when you talk about how you create these information silos, you put somebody in a black box. So you put, 50 million people in a black box and say, okay, only listen to what I say. Only listen to what I say. Don't listen to what anything else says. Don't look at radar maps. Don't look at weather maps. Only listen to what I say. If I tell you it's raining, that means it's raining. If I tell you it's not raining, that means it's not raining. I don't care if you feel stuff falling on your head. So when you do that, what you've done basically at that point, one, that's a very autocratic model, is only allow information from one source. But two, you're basically setting up a situation where you see information as a weapon. You don't see information as some kind of way to discover more, the truth or anything like that. Truth is irrelevant. Information is a weapon. So they're using the control of the information that's being seen and heard and everything like that over a certain number of people as a weapon. And again, this is where you get back to, well, why? Or weapon against who? Yeah. And it's against other Americans. The weapon, they're using this information as a weapon against other Americans. What's going on there? Again, does that mean that they're out on America? They're like, yo, I don't want America where all of us are in it here together. That's what it looks like to me. And that to me is unfortunate. What I hope is that people can break out of the black box and be able to start seeing things on their own and so forth. And therefore me say, hey, yeah, we as a country can be stronger together. Like I'm not out here saying my answer to this isn't to point to some enemy from within, which is apparently now what the Republicans and the right wing are saying now, is that now it's about these enemies telling all these people in the black box that only listen to what they say, hey, there's an enemy within that we got to worry about. And so it all of the objective seems to be to turn people against other Americans, turn Americans against other Americans. And I don't know how that ends in a positive way if that's going to continue down that path. We got we got to break people out of the black box that's being controlled, by these right-wing information systems.
Yeah, well, I can't predict the future, but historically, it's never ended well. This is how you get to Rwanda.
Well,
this
that's
is how
not necessarily
you get
true,
to
though.
The Balkans.
But you also got McCarthyism. You also got McCarthyism. You also got, like there are ways.
My point is, if it's not stopped, McCarthyism. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like, if we don't somehow put a kibosh on this thing, it's going to lead to just a disraveling of the society, unfortunately.
Which is what people like Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney see, is just like, that's why they're Republicans, lifelong Republicans. Dick Cheney was one of the top Republicans of the past 50 years.
They're rhinos, don't forget,
but that's only to the people that are in this black box. They aren't allowed to see or hear or view anything outside of the black box, only allowed to know what they're being told.
I want to get on, as you put in the black box point, because as you're talking about, it reminds me of another theme we've talked about, and it's really evident here again with the what do you call it? With the allusion to the natural disaster is the fact that this is an abusive relationship, like to the core, between this set of leaders who are behaving this way and the audience that keeps, wanting to converse with them.
I've noticed that for a long time.
And
it's like an abusive spouse.
But here's why it's more evident now, is because think about what we're saying. Human beings have been hurt in a natural disaster really bad. In the place, I've seen some of those images from North Carolina. It's terrible. Like, roads are freaking wiped away. People they're trying to fly in supplies on drones. This is serious stuff.
And it's like, who looks at all that and says, okay, well, what political party are they in? Like, who does that?
Here's my point, is saying, so now we have a guy running for president of the United States and people who are elected in Congress right now saying that the people that are trying to, like, literally go through mud to help other people and to rescue them, that those people are bad. And so it's like the victims of the storm are being attacked twice. The first attack was the natural disaster, and now the second attack is by our elected leaders who are doing this, who are making it more difficult. Like you said, I read the thing about the militia in North Carolina that showed up armed and the FEMA had to leave. Reading somewhere that in this one area of North Carolina where they had 250 emergency response people, they saved 3,200 people. Literally saved them out of, like, flooded homes and bad areas. And I'm thinking, so for every one rescue worker, that's over 10 citizens of the United States that are being saved. And yet we have militias now that are going around scaring those rescue workers.
Yeah.
And those
And
militias
again,
are being
to
egged
whose
on
interests
by,
are
yeah,
yeah. And
exactly.
whose interests are being served by that? And I mean, the abusive relationship, the full point, because we've talked about that for years, is the one thing an abusive spouse does to the abused spouse is try to isolate the abused spouse from from other people, so that they can't go to a friend or talk to a friend about it. The abusive spouse wants to isolate the abused and say, only listen to me, like your friends all hate you, all that kind of stuff. And that's what it sounds like when they're talking about, oh yeah, you can't listen to what this media outlet says, or like they're like, no, only thing you can believe is what comes out of my mouth. That sounds a
Yeah,
lot like an abusive spouse, because the abused spouse is made weak. And could the abused spouse go, hey, remember, united we stand, divided we fall. Well, the abused spouse is stronger if they can be
if they have a
surrounded
network.
by
Yeah,
other people. Yeah, and so the point being is that let's pull them away from other people and let's make them weaker. And that's what it looks like is what happened here. You stay here. You only listen to what I say. Don't listen to what anybody else says. If anybody else tries to help you, don't trust them. Yada yada yada. And it's like, yo, man, like that very much looks like an abusive relationship. And you have a large part of the American people being the abused spouse, and it's unfortunate. Like that's not something that I want to see. Like I said, we
yeah,
got to figure out a way to break these people out of this situation. How can we get through to them? And say, hey, you might be getting manipulated here. So, I mean, I think that, I do want to wrap this topic up, but it's very, very alarming.
yeah,
Because the reason for having a nation, the reason for coming together would be stuff like natural disasters, first and foremost, to be able to
yeah,
deal with nature. Like, and the other thing I'll say about this just briefly is that as a nation, we draw strength from being so large, being a large landmass, having a lot of people. That makes it more difficult because, as we talk about, there's people in one state, in Idaho or in Ohio, have no idea what's going on in Texas. It makes it harder. They feel less connected. But when we're able to get it right, as we've seen throughout history, the country has been able to do amazing things. So, again, we got to figure out a way, hopefully, to break enough Americans out of this black box where they're just told that other Americans are really bad and everybody's out to get them all the time, and they aren't able to get information as far as what's really going on. The information is just used as a weapon for them, and it's a weapon against other Americans. I mean, and like that's not a sustainable model, so to speak. That's
yeah.
McCarthyism. We overcame that, so hopefully we'll be able to overcome this as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as we wrap up for me that has been just eye opening, and I would propose we could even do a whole show on this is this really brings to light some of the conversations we've had in our society for the last 5-6 years, ever since COVID, which is about freedom of speech. Because and some of these things on these platforms and social media like Twitter, I mean, this is where a lot of these conspiracy theories get legs and run wild. And again, this just being different, it's a natural disaster. So I get it, when there's a pathogen, a new virus, and it's scary, and people don't know whether the vaccines are serious or ivermectin or whatever all these drugs were that we were told, and these different ways of doing it. When a road or a bridge is totally wiped out because of a flood, or when I look and see a whole neighborhood that's underwater, or the roofs are all missing because the tornado came through, I don't need to be convinced over what's right or wrong. Those people need help, period. And and that's what I'm saying. Like, the thought now, should the government be contacting the social media companies and asking them to tamp down misinformation? I don't know. See, that's what I mean. It brings up these good questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a thing to throw out at the last. When
So I said, that's another show.
Man.
Maybe
Yeesh, man. But I'll say this. I don't know. Like, I think the approach with social media, and I've said this in the past, and, I've seen it, now, so I'm encouraged, like the book that we're looking at now at Nexus, they talk about it in there as well. Like, the idea that it's not the social media companies as the publisher where the freedom of speech issue comes up. It's the social media company as the curator, as deciding what stuff gets amplified, what stuff gets seen the most. That's where the question of the freedom of speech comes in, I believe, more than anything, because I don't think it's necessary to go around telling the social media companies they got to remove a bunch of posts, but there does need to be some scrutiny on how they decide, and whether if it's a machine deciding it or whatever at this point, with the way that you have machine learning algorithms and so forth, but how they decide what to amplify. And if they're doing it solely based on what's going to generate the most engagement, then what we do know is that that's going to be lies and misinformation. That's going to get the most engagement, because that stuff can be tailored to strike emotional chords in a way that's going to generate the most engagement. So if there's going to have to be some kind of reckoning with that. Like if it's going to, if them as a curator though is not necessarily saying, hey, you can or cannot allow this to be, you have to take this down. That's different than saying, hey, I don't know that you can curate things in a way that is designed to misinform people. It may not be your intention to misinform people, but it's designed to do so because all you care about is how long their eyeballs are looking at the screen. So that's something to look at. We'll definitely get into that in a later show. But at this point, we don't want to go down that road. So let's wrap this topic up. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.